Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another lesson on Elizabethan England. Today we are starting a series of lessons in which I will be asking you to practice on some exam questions. Okay? So rather than having a series of exercises, I will ask you to answer the exam question. And in this video and in the transcript, because as always there is a transcript, I will try to explain you how to answer the question. In particular, today we will focus on the first question of the paper, which is worth 8 marks. And the question is on how to assess whether or not an interpretation is convincing. We'll look at the following 5 things. First, what is an interpretation? You might know that, but better to be on the safe side. 2, what is the topic of this particular question? 3, what elements are needed for a good answer? 4, what you should write in a good answer. And 5, I will read a model paragraph that I wrote. Let's start. First of all, what is an interpretation? Okay? An interpretation is a take on a historical event. It's the depiction or description of something that happened during the Elizabethan period. But there is a trick. Generally speaking, the AQA paper on Elizabethan England will show you some modern interpretation, okay? Not something that comes from the 16th or 17th century, but usually a drawing, an illustration, or possibly an extract from a modern historian, but usually from the 20th or the 19th century. This means that the interpretation is not a primary source for studying the 16th century. And this is important. It's an important point to write in your answer if you want to. It shows what modern people thought of those events rather than what contemporaries thought, people back then. This is a huge difference, since usually during in the period which an interpretation was made, will tell us more about that period in history rather than about the Elizabethan age itself. For example, illustrations made during the Victorian period will probably portray Elizabeth as Gloriana, this proud virgin queen who led her country to eternal greatness, not unlike how the Victorians saw their own queen. Now, you don't have to worry too much about this sort of interpretation. This is a bit of a more advanced stuff. For now, just keep in mind that interpretations tend to be modern and should be taken as such, okay? Not as what happened, but how people saw centuries later what happened. Since the question will ask you whether or not an interpretation is convincing, the fact that they were produced in modern times is usually a good hint to write yes but or no because. Moving on, second point, the topic of the question. In this particular case, the question asks us to assess whether or not in this particular interpretation of Queen Elizabeth signing the death warrant of Mary Queen of Scots, whether or not it is convincing. So let's look at the picture. Let me scroll up. We can see that it's not the virus, don't worry. Where is it? Yes. Elizabeth is looking pretty worried, pretty distraught, as if she had committed a horrible crime. Okay, she's there with the pen and say, oh my, what have I done? In front of her, you got her advisor, which is most likely William Cecil, possibly Walsingham, but my money is on Cecil, either insisting that she signs the warrant, saying, Majesty, you have to sign, or consoling her by telling her that what she's done was the right thing. So, this is the picture. This means that to answer the question, we will have to look at the relationship between the two ladies and see if Elizabeth in reality had any reason to feel bad about sending her cousin-rival to her death, and also about the role. We also need to look about the role of the council. Now, luckily, we are going to do just that. There are also going to be some articles in the transcript file which will provide you more contextual and factual knowledge that you will need to answer this question. So please read at least some of them. You don't have to read them all, it's too much, but choose at least one and read them, okay? Moving on, what are the elements of a good answer? It's an AQA question, So you will need the following elements in order to write a good answer. They are all in the GCSE revision booklet that I've uploaded at the beginning of this quarantine, so you will find them in the Google Classroom. First of all, you will need a complex explanation. Don't just say yes or no. That's a simple explanation. Explain why, linking it to your knowledge and using a peel structure. Then you will need to write down the usual 2 or more examples. Get this in your head. To answer an AQA question properly, you need 2 or more examples, okay? And they need to be explained. How do you explain them? Matching them against your contextual knowledge, so your knowledge of what was going on in the world at the time, of what was going on in the Elizabethan courts, and knowledge of the historical context, and possibly your factual knowledge. The more details you can throw in, the more names, dates, and facts you can throw in, the better. So, complex explanation, 2 or more, contextual knowledge, and factual knowledge. Now that that is out of the way, let's focus on the next section. How do you write the answer? First of all, decide whether the answer is whether the interpretation is convincing or not. Or, if you want to write an even better answer, be sure to point out some aspects that are convincing and maybe some aspects that are not, also based on your own knowledge. Once you've done that, you will need to explain why those 2 or more elements look convincing or not. And again, there is no magic method. There is no magical thing that will allow you to write a good answer automatically. You will need to practice and you will need to study and revise. As a general rule, the more you know, the better your answer will be. So revise while you can. In this case, most of the knowledge you will need to answer the question can be found in the websites linked below, especially maryqueenofscots.com, which apparently is a real thing and is also actually very useful and very concise. So it's not an encyclopedia, and if you had to read one of those articles, I would advise you to read that one. That said, we first need to look at the picture again, and we already identified 2 more elements. And we need to check their accuracy against our knowledge to see whether or not they are convincing. So, the 2 elements. Elizabeth looks distraught and morally devastated as if she did something wrong. 2. An advisor is convincing her to sign / consoling her. Let's check them against our knowledge of the period, which again, you can find in the articles below. This is mostly a technical explanation on how to answer a question. Okay? So, Elizabeth looks distraught. As you can see here, there is a square with an X, meaning not convincing. Why? So, she looks worried about the moral implications of what she did, as if she has done something wrong. In reality, from our letters, from the letters between Mary and Elizabeth, we know that she had a strong rivalry with her cousin. They never met. And Elizabeth possibly hated her. Why? You should already know the answer, because Mary was a magnet for plots and conspiracy. So, as testified by the letters, we know that it was unlikely that she was worried about her personally, okay? What was convincing, however, because there was one thing that was convincing about her looking worried, okay? She was worried about the political concerns. She was about to kill a queen. For example, what would happen with Scotland? Would the Scots just sit idly while Elizabeth killed their queen? Eventually they did, but she didn't know that. Will the French react while she killed the former French queen? Apparently they wouldn't, but she didn't know that, okay? And what about the English Catholics? Would they rise up in revolt? No, but again, she didn't know that. There were all sorts of things going on in her mind, and yeah, in general, she was worried about this. Also, killing a foreign king, a foreign monarch, could be seen by the Scots and by the French as an act of war. and this was the last thing Elizabeth needed in the 1580s. Remember, war with Spain, largest global power. Now, so we got a point that is not convincing, Elizabeth looking morally worried, but on the other hand, she might be worried about political things, so I guess, yes, that is sort of convincing. Point number two, element number two, the advisor trying to convince her. Sorry, I'm still trying to work out this thing. Why is it convincing? First, this is actually very convincing, okay? You can see there are two ticks instead of a tick and a cross. First, for two reasons. One of her advisors, in this case none other than William Cecil, eventually stole the warrant signed by Elizabeth and published it without permission, because the Queen was hesitating. As we said, she was worried what's going to happen. He would later be confined in the Tower of London for a few weeks to show everyone that the Queen still needed to be obeyed, but eventually it was recognized that he did politically the right thing. Okay, children, killing people is always bad, but politically it might be more or less convenient, especially if you live in the 16th century, which is a different time from ours. Another reason why it was convincing. Most of Elizabeth's advisors were actually putting pressure on her, and we know that from several primary sources, in order to make her sign the warrant and get rid of a troublesome claimant. So, we got two elements, okay? And for each element, we identified two reasons why, two points that might be convincing or not. With this in mind, let's read a model paragraph. In the transcript, the different sections of the paragraph are highlighted to show you where these points that we have just discussed are placed. Okay? Now, reading paragraph. This modern interpretation looks relatively convincing, since it shows Queen Elizabeth as being distraught and worried about the consequences of her signing the death warrant of Mary, Queen of Scots. This is the main point. The Queen looks concerned about what is going to happen now that she signed the warrant, and while the illustration makes it look as if she is worried about the moral implications of her actions, implying this is not convincing, it is likely that in reality she was more preoccupied by the political aspects of killing Mary. Her cousin was a foreign queen with ties to the French monarchy, and her death could be the beginning of a war with Scotland and France. Furthermore, connectors, killing a monarch was generally seen as an act of sacrilege in the 16th century. So you got why it's not convincing, why it is convincing, all filled with factual and contextual knowledge, okay? And this was the first of the two or more. The second, there is also an advisor, possibly William Cecil, factual knowledge, who seems to be either consoling her or putting pressure on her to sign. This is convincing because the Privy Council at the time was pushing for Elizabeth to get rid of Mary, who they saw as a troublesome claimant. Cecil himself eventually published the warrant of his own accord, and was therefore confined in the Tower of London for several weeks. Again, you show why it is convincing, you explain it thoroughly using your factual knowledge, and this is the second of the two or more points. What do you do next? You conclude. Very simple answer, like for these reasons, I believe that this source is somewhat convincing. Finished. Easy as, okay? So what do? You check the source, you look what's in the source, keeping in mind that it's modern, not old, not early modern, proper modern, and you check the contents of the source against your own knowledge, okay? Where does your knowledge come from? Either from me, yours truly, or from the articles I've linked below. I hope this was helpful. I'm looking forward to read your answers, and see you next time.